The lock clicked from the inside. I heard it. Soft but deliberate. The sound of being shut out. I stood there on the porch I painted myself 40 years ago, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The wind shifted. My shawl slipped off my shoulder. I did not reach for it. Behind the door I could hear her voice. Sharp. Dismissive. She's still out there, a pause. Then laughter. Not cool. Worse, dismissive. Like I was a misplaced package someone forgot to bring inside. I looked at the brass doorknob. It used to shine. Paul would polish it on Sundays. Now it was dull. Like the rest of me, I suppose. There was a time this porch was where Clara curled in my lap, a band-aid on her knee and a juice box in hand. I had kissed that knee. I had bandaged it myself. Now she locks me out. I did not knock. I did not call her name. She no longer uses mine. She says Ruth like it belongs to someone else. The tea trembled in my hand. Not from fear. From knowing. From finally knowing. That I no longer lived here. Not really. That the house with my memories had become just a backdrop for someone else's story. The porch creaked beneath me. My knees ached. I let the teacup rest on the step. And I turned away. Not because I was weak. But because I remembered something she had clearly forgotten. I still held the deed. This might not be my home anymore. But it was still my house. It was the smell of paint that brought it all back. Warm July air. Fresh cut wood. Paul's humming echoing in the hallway. We had just gotten the keys. The Victorian on Fairhope Street. Chipped railings, uneven floors, but he had looked at me and said, "Give me 6 months and a little sweat, Ruthie. We'll have our forever home." I had laughed then. Not because I doubted him, but because he made even broken things feel like blessings. I remember standing in the empty kitchen barefoot on cracked tile, running my hands across the faded cabinet doors. They were old, but sturdy, like us. Paul scrubbed every window frame that summer. I reupholstered the dining chairs. Clara, only 5, then danced in paint-stained socks while we sang along to a dusty transistor radio. It smelled like sawdust and lemon oil. And family. There was never much money. But we had grace. He fixed heating units for neighbors on weekends. I worked at the public library. Mornings were for coffee and crossword puzzles. Evenings were for slow dinners and porch swings. Clara used to fall asleep on my shoulder as cicadas hummed outside her window. Paul built her a treehouse even though he was afraid of heights. We planted hydrangeas though neither of us knew what we were doing. Some years they bloomed. Some years they didn't. Still, we called it our garden. That house didn't just hold our things. It held us. It was the smell of paint that brought it all back. Warm July air. Fresh cut wood. Paul's humming echoing in the hallway. We had just gotten the keys. The Victorian on Fairhope Street. Chipped railings, uneven floors, but he had looked at me and said, "Give me 6 months and a little sweat, Ruthie. We'll have our forever home." I had laughed then. Not because I doubted him. But because he made even broken things feel like blessings. I remember standing in the empty kitchen barefoot on cracked tile, running my hands across the faded cabinet doors. They were old. But sturdy. Like us. Paul scrubbed every window frame that summer. I reupholstered the dining chairs. Clara, only 5, then danced in paint-stained socks while we sang along to a dusty transistor radio. It smelled like sawdust and lemon oil. And family. There was never much money. But we had grace. He fixed heating units for neighbors on weekends. I worked at the public library. Mornings were for coffee and crossword puzzles. Evenings were for slow dinners and porch swings. Clara used to fall asleep on my shoulder as cicadas hummed outside her window. Paul built her a treehouse even though he was afraid of heights. We planted hydrangeas though neither of us knew what we were doing. Some years they bloomed. Some years they didn't. Still, we called it our garden. That house didn't just hold our things. It held us. It was the smell of paint that brought it all back. Warm July air. Fresh cut wood. Paul's humming echoing in the hallway. We had just gotten the keys. The Victorian on Fairhope Street. Chipped railings, uneven floors. But he had looked at me and said, "Give me 6 months and a little sweat, Ruthie. We'll have our forever home." I had laughed then. Not because I doubted him, but because he made even broken things feel like blessings. I remember standing in the empty kitchen barefoot on cracked tile, running my hands across the faded cabinet doors. They were old. But sturdy. Like us. Paul scrubbed every window frame that summer. I reupholstered the dining chairs. Clara, only 5, then danced in paint-stained socks while we sang along to a dusty transistor radio. It smelled like sawdust and lemon oil. And family. There was never much money. But we had grace. He fixed heating units for neighbors on weekends. I worked at the public library. Mornings were for coffee and crossword puzzles. Evenings were for slow dinners and porch swings. Clara used to fall asleep on my shoulder as cicadas hummed outside her window. Paul built her a treehouse even though he was afraid of heights. We planted hydrangeas, though neither of us knew what we were doing. Some years they bloomed. Some years they didn't. Still, we called it our garden. I used to whisper into Clara's hair as she lay in my lap on the porch. "This house will always know your name." She would look up, eyes sleepy, and say, "Then it will never forget me, Mama." I believed her. Because back then everything still felt whole. Even the crooked doors and sagging roof held us together like arms that never let go. Paul called it ours until the very last day. He never said mine. Only home. Now I wonder if I should have held tighter to that word. Home. Because what we built with sweat and faith became something I could be locked out of. But not yet. Not in this memory. Not in this moment. In this moment, the wind still smelled like fresh soil. Paul still hummed in the hallway. And Clara still believed the house would remember her voice. So did I. Paul passed on a Tuesday morning. The house was quiet except for the birds outside the sunroom and the soft churn of the kettle I had forgotten to turn off. He had been ill for months. Cancer, the quiet kind that doesn't shout until it wins. I had set up a cot in the downstairs den, turned it into a bedroom. The stairs had grown too cruel. Each night I read to him. Old books. Psalms. Sometimes just the newspaper out loud. He liked the way I said the weather. He died with my hand in his. His last breath left warm against my wrist. The house didn't creak that morning. It simply sighed. I stayed. For 5 more years. In every drawer he lingered, his handwriting on sticky notes, his aftershave on the edge of the medicine cabinet, the groove he left on his side of the bed. I used to sit in the kitchen after sunset and swear I could hear his footsteps on the porch. Grief has a sound. It's not loud. It's the absence of music you forgot was playing. Clara came less and less. Her job kept her busy, then the baby came, then the divorce. Life kept her moving while mine slowed to a crawl. Then one day, over lukewarm coffee and silence, she said, "Mom, this house is too big for you now." I said, "It never felt big when I had people in it." She smiled gently, but her eyes darted past mine. She had a proposal, a guest room in her home. Help with groceries. See the grandkids more. "It'll be easier for both of us," she said. I hesitated. Not because I did not love her, but because the curtains still smelled of Paul. And I was afraid that if I left, he would too. But loneliness makes ghosts feel like friends. So I agreed. We packed everything into boxes. Some labeled. Some not. Clara sent most of the furniture to donation. The new tenants will want to redecorate anyway. I ran my hand across the old dining table one last time. Paul's coffee stain was still faintly there. I left it. The house was rented out. A young couple with a dog. I never met them. Clara called it a fresh start. I called it a pause. But I told myself, home is not walls. It is people. And maybe if I followed her, I'd still belong somewhere. The guest room was small. No windows. One closet. Just enough space for a twin bed and a bookshelf Clara said I could use until we figure out storage. The walls were beige. Not the warm kind. The kind that made time feel longer. Still, I smiled. Still, I said thank you. I arranged my books. My scarves. Hung a single photo of Paul beside the lamp. He looked out of place. Like me. At first, things were kind. Clara brought me chamomile tea on Sundays. Her husband Mark carried in boxes and asked if I needed help connecting the old radio. I thought, maybe this is what family looks like now. A new version. A little tighter. But stitched with love. I cooked on Fridays. We shared soup and bread. Laughed about the way the dog hated thunder. But then, my flower pots on the porch disappeared one day. Clara said it made the space look too busy. My old quilt vanished from the living room. Replaced by something gray and smooth and cold. One afternoon, she swapped my alarm clock for a sleek digital one. Said it matched the aesthetic. No one asked. She began correcting how I folded towels. Said the scent of garlic lingered too long. Asked if I could keep my music on headphones. It's just easier with the kids' schedules, she would say. So I complied. I always complied. I placed my shoes exactly on the mat. Washed every dish I touched. Kept my voice low after 9:00 p.m. I told myself this was love. Just a quieter version. But one night, I overheard her in the kitchen. She was laughing with a friend. "Oh, Ruth," a voice asked. "She still lives with you?" Clara chuckled. "She just kind of stays here. Like a stain. Like a misplaced lamp someone couldn't throw out yet." The friend laughed, then changed the subject. I didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stood behind the hallway wall listening. It was the moment I realized this was no longer my daughter's invitation. It was her permission. And mine was quietly expiring. It began with the dining chairs. Clara replaced them one afternoon while I was out buying dish soap. She said the old ones were too creaky. But Paul had fixed those chairs with his hands. I could still see the glue line under the joints. I asked where she had put them. "They're gone," she said. "Donation center picked them up." Just like that. Gone. No warning. No thank you. No room for memory. I stood in the hallway watching the new chairs glint under the overhead light. They were smooth. Shiny. Hollow. That weekend, she hosted a dinner. Old coworkers. Mark's business partner. A new neighbor who wore too much perfume. I spent the afternoon cooking. Roast chicken. Green beans with lemon. Shortbread cookies from my mother's recipe. Clara never asked me to. She just assumed. When the guests arrived, she directed them toward the living room. Offered wine. Laughed too loudly. I stayed in the kitchen. Like I always did. Wiping the same counter twice. When I brought out the tray of cookies, a woman looked at me and smiled politely. "Did you bake these?" she asked. Before I could answer, Clara said, "Oh, she just loves helping out. It gives her something to do." The room chuckled. Not cruel. But distant. As if I were a friendly ghost who wandered the kitchen and occasionally made biscuits. No one looked at me after that. They just took. One man said the cookies were a bit dry. Another asked if I could fetch more ice. So I did. Quietly. Because I didn't want Clara to wince in front of her guests. Because it was easier than watching her pretend I wasn't her mother. After dinner, I collected plates. Stacked them carefully. Rinsed without making noise. Mark passed by. Mumbled thanks Ruth and disappeared up the stairs. Not Mom. Not even Mrs. Dawson. Just Ruth. As if I were a tenant with a short lease. That night in the dark of the laundry room I folded napkins with shaking hands. Each fold whispered something I wasn't ready to say aloud. I wasn't part of this home. I was part of its routine. It started with garlic. One evening, I was sautéing onions for the lentil stew Paul used to love. Clara came home early. She stood by the stove wrinkling her nose. "Can we not cook with garlic during the week?" she said. "The smell lingers. Mark hates it." I looked down at the pan. Lowered the heat. "I didn't know," I said. She smiled tight efficient. "You didn't do anything wrong. It's just better for everyone. Better for everyone. Except me." Next came the television. At 9:05 p.m., she knocked lightly on my door. "Just a heads up," she said, "we're trying to keep the house calm at night." I had been watching an old black and white film. No yelling. Just piano music and two people in love. I muted it. Smiled. Said, "Of course, dear." I began going to bed earlier. Not from tiredness. From compression. The house shrank around me, one rule at a time. No loud phone calls. No laundry on weekends. No soaking dishes in the sink. No shoes on the rug. And no guests. I had asked only once if Edna could come over for tea. Clara hesitated. "We're just trying to keep the place uncluttered." Edna, who helped me after Paul died. Who drove me to doctor appointments when I forgot how to ask for help. I told her not to come. Said the house was noisy. Said I wasn't feeling well. She knew I was lying. But she didn't say so. Just whispered, "I miss you, Ruthie," and hung up slow. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, listening to the hum of the air purifier Clara had placed near the door. She said it helped regulate allergens. But all it did was drown out memory. I tried journaling. Then stopped. The pages stayed blank after a while. My handwriting began to look like someone else's. I still cooked. Still cleaned. Still sorted the mail. But I did not decorate. Did not hum. The radio stayed off. The garlic stayed sealed. I moved like a whisper through the rooms I used to fill. One evening I overheard her on the phone again. "She means well," Clara said. "But it's like having someone watching you all the time. Like emotional clutter. Emotional clutter." I stood there holding a damp dish towel. And something in me small and soft folded. Not broke. Not yet. But folded. That phrase sat in my chest long after the phone call ended. Emotional clutter. Not even miss. Clutter. The kind people sweep under rugs, hide behind curtains, hope guests will not notice. I walked back to my room. Closed the door without sound. Inside everything was still. Too still. I looked around. The books had dust on their spines. The framed photo of Paul was slightly crooked. I left it that way. At dinner, the next night, the table was set for 4. Me, Clara, Mark, and one of his colleagues. I had roasted a chicken. Mashed potatoes. Steamed carrots with rosemary. Clara didn't say thank you. She just placed the napkins as if I were invisible. Halfway through the meal, Mark's friend leaned back smiling at his plate. "This is incredible," he said. "Who cooked it?" Before I could speak, Clara jumped in. "Oh God, no. Not me." She laughed, eyes rolling. "That's our resident freeloader's doing." The air went still. The laughter around the table was short and shallow. Mark cleared his throat. No one looked at me. I smiled. Not from humor. From habit. Then I excused myself. Washed my plate. Wiped the sink. and sat in the dark at the edge of my bed until the house quieted. That night, the word, freeloader, echoed louder than the dishes in the sink. I thought of the word Paul used to call me. Partner. I remembered the way he touched my wrist at breakfast. The way he waited for me to sit down before taking a bite. He never made me ask for space. He made it. Now I was allowed to cook. Allowed to clean. Allowed to stay quiet. But I was no longer invited to belong. The next morning, I found a note Clara had left on the counter. Please don't use the scented dryer sheets. They irritate Mark's nose. No hi Mom. No thanks. Just rules. I folded the note in half. Placed it under the sugar jar. Then I brewed a cup of tea. No garlic. No music. Just silence. And something slowly hardening in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. But something like frost. A quiet edge. The kind that forms when you realize you have overstayed a welcome that was never spoken aloud. It was a Thursday afternoon. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and the hallway buzzed with quiet. I was folding laundry. Mine, Clara's, Mark's, even their children's socks. Habit is hard to unlearn. Clara walked in holding a folder. It was slim. White. Too clean. She sat down across from me, crossed her legs like a woman in charge. Mom, she said, her voice dipped in sugar, I need a small favor. I looked up from a towel. What kind of favor? She slid the folder forward. Just some paperwork. About the house. Nothing big. The word house landed softly like a stone wrapped in silk. I didn't open the folder. Just stared at it. For tax purposes, she added. Refinancing. Maybe equity apps. Everything would stay the same. Still, I didn't move. My hands rested on cotton. My breath slowed. You'd still live here, of course, she smiled. Nothing would change. Nothing. Except the name on the deed. I picked up the towel again. Folded it deliberately. The old way Paul liked sharp, even edges. I don't think that's necessary, I said. Her smile thinned. You wouldn't even need to leave the house. Walter could notarize it. She hadn't said his name in years. She stood up. I'm just trying to make things easier. Then she walked out. The folder stayed on the table like a trap left open. Waiting. I didn't touch it. But that night, as I lay on the twin bed beneath the hum of the purifier, I replayed her words. Equity. Tax. Ownership. She had stopped calling it your house. Now it was just the house. Words matter when silence is all you have left. I rose early the next morning. Before the coffee brewed. Before Mark's footsteps creaked above me. I opened my small safe. The metal was cold. Inside, my birth certificate. Paul's death certificate. And the deed. Still in my name. Since 1983. Untouched. Unshared. Undeniable. I ran my fingers across the embossing. Paul's signature. My own. My hands shook. Not from fear. From clarity. The house wasn't a favor. It was mine. And something told me, Clara had already forgotten that. The phone rang at 10:17 in the morning. It was the bank. Polite voice. Tense tone. Questions I didn't understand. Mrs. Dawson, she said, we're just confirming details on your recent home equity application. My chest went cold. I didn't submit anything. A pause. Too long. Then a rustle of papers. Well, we received documentation. Signed forms. A copy of the deed. I swallowed hard. What name was on the paperwork? Clara Ann Dawson. The woman hesitated. She listed herself as sole owner. Caregiver. Executor. Caregiver. I felt the word punch me in the ribs. Could you send me copies? I asked. Another pause. Then, yes. Of course. We'll email and mail them. We thought something felt off. The call ended. I stood still in the kitchen. The coffee pot hissed. Birds chirped outside. Everything normal. Everything wrong. By afternoon, the envelope arrived. Overnighted. Thick. I sat at the small dining table. Hands trembling. I opened it. Inside, pages of signatures. Typed lies. Stamps, dates. Her name. Not mine. Over and over. She said I was no longer of sound mind. Said I had given her full control. Said the house was hers by inheritance. Inheritance. I was still breathing. I didn't cry. Just stared. As if looking long enough might change the ink. That evening, I waited in the kitchen. Lights low. Document still in hand. Clara came in. She was humming. She stopped when she saw me. I spoke to the bank, I said. Calm. Clear. She didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. Just reached for a glass of water. You shouldn't dig into things you don't understand, she said softly. I understand enough, I said. You tried to steal my house. She leaned against the counter. Sipped her water. Set it down slow. You're not getting younger, she said flatly. You don't work. You don't contribute. My hand gripped the paper. But I didn't raise my voice. I cook, I said. I clean. I keep this place running. She smiled. Dry. Cruel. You exist, she said. Like wallpaper. Something shifted then. Not in her. In me. Not rage. Not yet. But something sharp. And awake. She didn't yell. Clara never needed to. Her voice had that practiced calm that slices deeper than rage. We stood in the kitchen. She sipped water. I held the paper like it might burn. You think this matters, she said. Pointed at the deed in my hands. That paper. She laughed. It means nothing. You don't own this house, Mom. Not really. You live here because we let you. Let me. Like I was a stray dog granted a warm porch. Because I had a moment of guilt, she added, and thought maybe it would be nice to have family around. Her eyes narrowed. But let's be honest, no one kept you here out of love. I felt those words fall on me like stones. Not loud. Just heavy. I steadied my breath. It's still in my name, I said. My name is on the deed. She stepped closer. You want to play smart, she hissed. Fine, but this is still my house now. I shook my head. This house belonged to your father and me. Long before you understood what a roof even meant. She smiled tight and wrong. Then maybe you should go live with him. Silence. Real silence. Thick enough to swallow the whole kitchen. Then she walked out. I thought that would be the end. But it wasn't. 2 nights later, I dropped a glass on the tile. It shattered loud. My hands trembled as I knelt. Clara stormed in. What now? She snapped. I'm sorry, I whispered. It slipped. She raised a hand. I'm done. Her voice was steel. You've been hovering. You've been judging. You've been taking. I stood slowly. Clara. No, she cut me off. You don't belong here anymore. You never really did. Then she pulled out her phone. Tapped the screen. Held it to her ear. Hello, yes, she said. Calm as rain. I need to report a trespasser. My breath stopped. She turned her back. Left me in a kitchen I once called mine. And in that moment, barefoot on the tile surrounded by broken glass and rosemary from my old garden, I knew. She wanted me gone. Not later. Now. And for the first time, I didn't feel like her mother. I felt like an object she was trying to erase. I did not pack. I did not cry. I walked out the back door. Into the garden. My garden. The same stretch of soil where Paul and I planted hydrangeas in our second summer. Where Clara once chased fireflies in bare feet and left a trail of jelly fingerprints on the porch railing. The rosemary bush still leaned toward the sunlight. Bent, but alive. I sat on the stone bench Paul built from leftover tile. It wobbled slightly under my weight. The air smelled like cut grass and something fading. Clara's voice still echoed behind me. Clear. Sharp. Final. I need to report a trespasser. She meant me. In the house where her first steps echoed. Where her father died. Where I boiled bottles and sewed curtains and stayed awake while the fever broke. I looked at my hands. Still speckled with dish soap. Still steady. Not shaking. Not yet. Birdsong drifted in from a neighbor's yard. But here inside this patch of memory, there was only the hum of betrayal. What hurt more than her words was the ease of them. The way she could speak to strangers more kindly than to me. She used to braid her hair by my knee. Ask me what clouds were made of. Fall asleep pressed against my arm because your heart sounds like the ocean, mama. Now she called me clutter. A freeloader. A legal inconvenience. My throat ached, but I made no sound. There was a quiet war happening inside me. Between grief and reason. Between staying and leaving. I had nowhere to go. But I also could not stay. Not anymore. Paul would have hated this. He once said, if this house ever makes you feel small, you leave it. We built it for love, not for shame. I brushed my hand against the rosemary. Crushed a leaf between my fingers. Brought it to my nose. It still smelled like him. Like something real. Something that could not be stolen. A bee buzzed past. Unbothered by my presence. Unlike Clara. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel tired. I felt done. Done waiting for kindness that would not come. Done folding napkins like an apology. Done hoping my silence would earn me space. The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched across the lawn like reaching arms that never quite touched. I stood slowly. My knees stiff. But steady. Inside the lights flicked on. Someone laughed, Mark maybe. The sound felt foreign. I looked up at the house. At the windows I had once cleaned every spring. At the gutters I used to clear in the rain. And I said, soft but certain, this is not my home anymore. Then I walked back inside. Not to stay. But to start collecting what was mine. The house felt colder when I stepped back in. Not in temperature. In temperature of soul. Clara had gone upstairs. Her footsteps faded. Mark's voice murmured from behind a closed door. I moved through the kitchen like a shadow that refused to disappear. My hands knew where everything was. Still, after all this time, I opened the drawer by the sink. Slipped the bank envelope in. Covered it with a placemat. I would need that soon. Then I went to my room. The guest room as they called it. 4 walls. 1 window. A borrowed bed. And a shelf that still smelled of lemon polish. I sat at my little desk. The one Clara offered until we find something better. It had 1 drawer. Inside a silver-framed photo from 1967. Paul in his wedding suit. Me in a cream dress Mama helped me sew. I wrapped it in a scarf. The soft one Paul bought me after his first raise. I placed it in my suitcase. Then the deed. Then our marriage certificate. Then the letter from the hospital that confirmed his passing. Everything that proved I existed. We existed. I packed slow. Not from age. From ritual. Some women pray. I sort documents. There was a rhythm in it. A dignity. At the bottom of the drawer I found a card. Walter's card. Paul's best friend. Retired attorney. Godfather to Clara. And the only man I trusted when it came to what was mine. I placed it in the outer pocket. It felt warm against my palm. Like a key. I did not rush. I folded 2 dresses. 1 shawl, a pair of shoes. And the mint plant I kept on the windowsill. Tiny. But alive. Then I sat on the bed. Not to rest. To breathe. Because something had shifted. This was no longer a question of whether I was wanted. It was a choice. Do I let them rewrite me while I am still breathing? Outside the door, Clara's voice drifted down the hall. I heard her say, "She's probably sulking. She does this for attention." Mark didn't respond. At least not loud enough for me to hear. I didn't care. Because attention was no longer my currency. Truth was. I opened my journal. The one I had left blank for weeks. And I wrote 1 line. I'm not a freeloader, I'm a homeowner. Then I closed the book. Zipped the suitcase. Stood up. The room didn't feel like mine anymore. But my story, that still belonged to me. And for the first time in years, I was going to use it. It was still dark when I opened my eyes. The room was silent except for the hum of the air purifier. I sat up, pulled the shawl tighter around my shoulders, and slipped my feet into worn slippers. It was 5:12 in the morning. Outside the garden slept. Inside, I moved like a woman with nothing left to prove and everything left to claim. I reached for the suitcase. Checked each item again. The papers. The scarf-wrapped photo. The card. Walter Brenner. Attorney. Paul's best friend since high school. Present at our wedding. Present when Paul passed. I ran my thumb over the embossed lettering. Then I picked up the landline phone still plugged in near the window, still reliable when cell signals flickered. I dialed the number. 2 rings. Then his voice. Groggy but steady. Hello. Walter, I said. It's Ruth. He paused. Then softly, is everything all right? I hesitated. Then told him the truth. I think it's time I stopped being quiet. Another pause. Then a slow exhale. Come at 10, he said. Bring everything. He didn't ask for details. He never had to. The sun had barely begun to rise. I placed the phone back. Looked out the window. A robin landed near the rosemary bush. It hopped once. Then twice. I whispered, "Good morning," to no one in particular. Then I brewed tea. Mint and black. Paul's favorite blend. I sat at the table, hands around the warm mug, watching the light slip across the floorboards. It felt like ceremony. Like a goodbye I hadn't spoken out loud. Upstairs, a door creaked. Mark probably. Early riser. But he wouldn't come down yet. Clara always slept in on Thursdays. I had time. Time to breathe. To be. Time to leave, not in panic but in power. My suitcase rested near the door. Unassuming. Modest. But inside it proof. Legacy. And the one thing Clara never expected me to use, my voice. At 7:18 in the morning I pulled on my walking shoes. Simple. Worn at the heel. But they had carried me through grief before. I zipped the suitcase. Turned off the stove. Wiped the counter one last time. Not out of duty. Out of habit. Clara and Mark were still upstairs. I did not want a goodbye. I wanted a beginning. The front door creaked like it always did. A memory Paul used to call our alarm system. I stepped outside. The sky was overcast. Not gloomy, just undecided. Birds moved in soft arcs across the wires. The garden was behind me, but its scent followed. I walked 3 blocks to the corner bus stop, the one I hadn't used in years. People were already lining up, young man in scrubs, woman with a stroller, teenager tapping on her phone. No one noticed me. That was fine. I stood still. Not small. The bus came at 7:42. I stepped on, paid in cash, and found a seat near the back. No one asked questions. I did not offer answers. My hands rested on the suitcase. It felt warm from my grip, almost like a pulse. As the city moved outside the window, I allowed myself one thought. She will notice. Maybe not this hour, but soon. And when she does, she will look for my name. On documents, on walls, on labels. And realize she erased the wrong person. Downtown came fast. The streets pulsed with morning motion. At 9:04, I stepped off. Walked 4 more blocks. Walter's house hadn't changed. Still had the citrus trees. Still smelled faintly of dust and lavender. He opened the door in his cardigan. Glasses perched on his forehead. "Ruth," he said, smiling like I hadn't just brought him the weight of a lifetime. "You look like hell." I laughed. The sound startled me. "I'm ready," I said. "Let's sit," he replied. And we did. At his kitchen table. Like we had after Paul's funeral. Like we had when Clara was born. He reached for the folder. "Let's get your house back." Walter flipped through the documents like a man handling memory. Not just paper. He paused at each page. Read slowly. Made notes. "This is all in your name," he said. "Still. Legally. Unquestionably." I nodded. "I want to sell," I said. Soft. But firm. He looked up. "You sure?" "Yes." He leaned back. His eyes kind. "You do not need revenge," he said. "You need distance." "I need peace," I replied. We spent an hour drafting protections. Reviewing steps. Listing assets. By 11:15 in the morning the paperwork was done. He slid the final document toward me. "I'll handle the filing. You need a realtor." I nodded. "I know someone," he said. "Discreet. Efficient. Kind." He handed me a business card. Jessica Tran. Young. Bright-eyed. The daughter of a woman I once worked with at the library downtown. I remembered her coming in after school, sitting in the corner near the poetry shelf. "She'll meet you this afternoon," Walter said. I stood up. Gathered the folder. Shook his hand. "You're doing the right thing," he said. I smiled. A tired smile. "But mine. I'm not trying to win," I said. "I'm trying to reclaim." He nodded. "That's the real kind of winning." By 1:30 in the afternoon Jessica met me outside the house. Not Clara's, mine. She walked the perimeter. Took photos. Jotted notes. She didn't ask why I was selling. She just said, "This place has soul." And I almost cried. Almost. We sat on the front steps. She passed me a clipboard. "You need to authorize the listing," she said. The pen felt heavier than it looked. But my hand did not shake. I signed. Slow. Clear. Certain. Jessica smiled. "I'll handle everything." I watched her leave. Then I sat on the porch until the sun began to shift. Inside, Clara was still unaware. But the silence had already begun to change shape. Not fear. Not tension. But movement. Forward. Away. away from apology, toward truth. And as I stood, dusted off my skirt and picked up my suitcase, I whispered, "She'll learn, but not from me. Not this time." If someone ever tried to erase your place in the home you built, would you reclaim it or walk away? Share your quiet answer in the comments. You never know who it might heal. The motel was plain, clean, quiet, cash only. The man at the desk barely looked up. "Single room?" he asked. I nodded. He handed me a key. Room 214. Second floor. Facing the back alley. No view. No noise. Just mina. I opened the door and stepped inside. The carpet was worn. The bedspread floral. The bathroom tile chipped. But there was no clutter. No judgment. No voices behind closed doors. I placed my suitcase in the corner. Unzipped it slowly. Took out the silver-framed photo of Paul and me. Set it on the small desk beside the lamp. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old wood. I opened the window. Let the air in. The curtain fluttered like a breath. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and just breathed. No schedule. No chores. No being useful to prove I belonged. Just air, light, and stillness. I made tea using the electric kettle. Mint. Poured it into a paper cup. Held it with both hands like it might run away. Outside a car honked. Distant. Not for me. I closed my eyes and listened to nothing. And nothing felt like a miracle. Later that evening, I called Jessica. She answered on the first ring. "I listed it privately," she said. "No open house. Only qualified buyers." "Good," I replied. "There's already interest," she added. "A woman from Napa. Cash buyer. Wants a home garden." I smiled. That garden still had roots even if I did not. "She'll love the rosemary," I said. Jessica paused. She said the house reminded her of her grandmother's. That's why she called me. I turned toward the window. "Then maybe it's time," I said. "For it to become someone else's beginning." Jessica's voice softened. "I'll keep you posted, Ruth." "Thank you, dear." I hung up. Set the phone down. Then walked to the mirror. Looked at myself. Not as someone's mother. Not as someone's mistake. But just me. Lines on my face. Hair thinning at the edges. But eyes still steady. I touched my cheek. And whispered, "You're still here." And that was enough for today. The next morning, I woke to light. Soft. Filtered through sheer curtains. No banging doors. No voices through the walls. Just morning. And me. I boiled water. Steeped another cup of mint tea. Tore open a packet of saltines. Breakfast of women who carry too much and ask too little. I sat by the window. Watched a squirrel dart across the alley fence. Listened to the wind play with an empty soda can. Simple things. But they made a kind of music. I pulled out my journal. The one I hadn't opened since the guest room. There were pages missing. Ripped out on nights I tried to erase myself before anyone else could. I turned to a blank one. Wrote day 1. No one called me a burden today. Then I underlined it. Twice. I flipped to the front and wrote my full name in cursive. Ruth Dawson. Not mom. Not grandma. Not you people. Just me. Later that day, Jessica called. "There's an offer," she said. "All cash. From the woman I mentioned. Diane." "Yes. She's ready to close." She asked about the garden. I felt something tug inside me. A root loosening gently. "She can have it," I said. "It deserves hands that tend it." Jessica's voice brightened. She asked to meet you. Only if you're comfortable. I paused. I think I'd like that, I said. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the property. Neutral ground. New light. That evening I laid out my clothes. A soft blouse. Trousers with a crease. The brooch Paul gave me on our 40th anniversary. A little worn but still catching the light. I sat on the bed. Folded my hands. I wasn't just signing over a property, I was choosing what not to carry anymore. Regret. Obligation. Begging for a seat at the table I had set for years. The air was still. But my chest felt full. Not from pain. From quiet power. I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. I only needed to show up. And tomorrow I would. The cafe was small. Brick walls. Soft jazz playing overhead. The kind of place where no one rushed you. I arrived 5 minutes early. Chose a table near the window. Ordered chamomile tea. With honey. Then waited. But not nervously. Diane walked in at exactly 11:00. She was taller than I imagined. Wearing jeans, a pale blue blouse, and a look that said she had weathered storms. She saw me. Smiled. I stood. We shook hands. Firm. Warm. Thank you for meeting me, she said. Of course. We sat. She ordered a latte, then turned to me with careful eyes. I saw the house, she said. And the garden. It feels lived in. Loved. I nodded. It has been. She glanced down at her hands. My mother passed last year, she said softly. She loved rosemary. Kept some in every room. I looked at her. Really looked. Lines near the mouth. Eyes a little tired. But kind. She would have liked that garden, I said. Diane smiled. I think she sent me to it. We talked. About wallpaper. Faucet handles. The tree in the back that still drops sap in spring. Not once did she ask why I was leaving. Not once did she treat me like a transaction. When our drinks were nearly done, she said, I want to buy it. Not just the house, the story in the walls. That made something break loose in the center of my chest. Not sadness. Not pride. Relief. You will take good care of it, I said. I already plan to, she replied. We shook hands again. No pen. No paper. Just agreement. Between 2 women who knew what it meant to lose a place and fight quietly to belong again. I left the cafe with lighter steps. Outside the wind lifted my scarf. I let it. I did not need that house anymore. Because now it would belong to someone who saw it. And somehow, in her eyes she saw me too. The envelope was pale yellow. Thick. Stamped with a law firm's return address. Jessica called before it arrived. It's been notarized, she said. Sent priority. They'll have it by morning. I nodded. Let them read it. By 8:30 in the morning the courier rang the bell of the house that used to be mine. Mark answered. Still in pajama bottoms. Holding a coffee mug. He signed. Brought it inside. Clara stood at the kitchen island, stirring yogurt, scrolling her phone. What's that? She asked. Looks legal, he muttered. From Ruth's lawyer. She raised an eyebrow. Lawyer. Mark slid the envelope across the counter. She opened it. Pulled out the papers. 3 pages. All typed. All final. Transfer of ownership. Filed. Completed. Sale of the property to Diane Westfield. Effective immediately. Notice of tenancy termination. 7 days to vacate. Or face legal eviction. And at the bottom, Ruth Dawson. In cursive, neat, unmistakable. Clara went still. Mark looked at her. Waited. She reread the first page. Then the second. No, she said. Then again, louder number. She picked up her phone. Dialed. It rang once. Twice. Straight to voicemail. Again. And again. 12 calls in under an hour. Each one unanswered. She left one message. Mom, what are you doing? You cannot sell this house. We live here. You need to call me back. Please. She didn't say sorry. Didn't say thank you. Didn't say anything that would have mattered. She said we. Not you. Not once did she say this was your home first. Not once did she ask are you okay? Because in her world ownership had never been about paper. It was about power. And now that power was shifting. In silence. From the mother she tried to erase. To the woman she no longer recognized. By noon, Clara had called 17 times. Still no answer. She texted. Emailed. Even sent a message through Mark's phone in case hers was being blocked. Nothing. Silence. It unnerved her. She wasn't used to not being heard. She paced the kitchen papers still spread on the counter. This is a mistake, she muttered. Mark leaned against the wall, watching her unravel. She owns the house, he said, careful. She lived here for 12 years, she snapped. She cannot just disappear and take it with her. She never gave it to us, he said quietly. Clara turned. Sharp. She lived rent-free. She cleaned. She cooked. She watered your roses. She packed our lunches. Every week. Clara stared at him, eyes narrowing. So what? That makes her the landlord now. Mark didn't reply. Not at first. Then she never stopped being the owner. That landed heavy. She sat down. Hard. Her thumb hovered over her phone. Dialed again. It rang. Went silent. She cursed under her breath. Then did something she hadn't done in years. She went outside. Walked the garden. Stared at the rosemary bush, the stone bench, the patches of soil she used to call messy. Suddenly, they looked sacred. She crouched. Touched the dirt. Cold. Still damp from morning dew. She hadn't watered it in weeks. Her mother had. All these years, and she hadn't noticed how much care lived in the quiet. Now the quiet was gone. And she didn't know how to fill it. She went back inside. Logged onto her laptop. Searched the county property records. There it was. Sale finalized. Deed transferred. Ruth Dawson, former owner. Diane Westfield, new. Clara read it again. And again. Each time the truth grew louder. Mom didn't threaten. She acted. She didn't yell. She disappeared. And somehow that was worse. Because it meant she had stopped waiting. Stopped hoping. Stopped believing that love could survive neglect. Now Clara was the one left waiting by the door. Waiting for a voice that no longer answered. On Friday, a white van pulled into the driveway. Not a delivery. A moving company. The men wore gray shirts and looked confused. You sure this is the address? One asked. Clara stood in the doorway. Sunglasses on. Jaw clenched. Yes, she said. Start with the upstairs. Boxes piled quickly. Labeled. Taped. Numbered. Mark carried 2 by himself. No words. No comfort. She didn't ask for any. By late afternoon, the house was hollow. Every room echoed. No scent of food. No music. No footsteps in the hallway. Clara walked the perimeter once. Paused by the rosemary. Tore off a sprig. Held it between her fingers like it meant something. Then dropped it. At 6:03 in the evening, she locked the door for the last time. The key stayed inside. She got in the car. Mark already behind the wheel. Hands on the steering wheel, eyes far away. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To my sister's," he said. Flat. She didn't argue. As they pulled away, she looked back once. The porch light flicked on automatically. An empty welcome. That same evening, in a small apartment downtown, I was folding laundry. Mine. Only mine. The windows were open. A breeze lifted the curtains. The mint plant on the balcony had begun to grow new leaves. I brewed tea. Let it steep. The phone buzzed. I didn't check it. Instead, I sat at the table and opened my journal. Wrote. "She's gone." Then I added, "and so am I." But this time, not in the way they hoped. I had left. Yes. But not out of shame. Not out of surrender. I had left to make space for myself again. And in doing so, I had taken the house and the silence with me. Not to punish. But to protect. Some things are better grown far from those who refuse to water them. The sun rose slowly over the rooftops of downtown. I watched it from the window. The glass was streaked with light mist, and outside the city hummed not loudly, just enough to remind me I was no longer hidden. The mint plant had grown taller. New leaves curled toward the light. I reached over, pinched one, gently rubbed it between my fingers. Paul used to do that on Sundays. Said it woke him better than coffee. I smiled. In this small apartment, nothing belonged to anyone else. Not the chairs. Not the teacups. Not the air. Every drawer opened to something I had chosen to keep. Nothing forced. Nothing expected. There was peace in that. A quiet, deliberate kind of peace. On the far wall, I'd pinned up photographs. Not many. Just 4. Paul in his workshop. Lauren as a baby grinning in a high chair. A blurry photo of my old garden. And one of me taken accidentally years ago laughing with flour on my nose. It felt important to be seen that way. Unpost. Unapologetics. I kept a small table beneath those frames. Sometimes I sat there just to remember that I'd lived a real life. Not always grand. But fully mine. Diane had sent a postcard last week. A photo of the garden. The rosemary bush still full. Her note said, "It feels like someone's heart grew here." She did not need to write more. I replied with just one sentence. It did. Some mornings I walked to the market and bought tulips even when they cost too much. I let them wilt on their own schedule. No one asked why I needed flowers. No one asked anything at all. Some days I wrote in my journal and did not try to be profound. Only true. Like the line I wrote last night. I did not leave out of anger. I left out of finally remembering I had feet. Once a neighbor knocked to ask if I wanted to join bingo night. I declined. Not because I was angry. Because I was full. Sometimes solitude is not a lack. It is a room that stays warm because no one keeps opening the door. The phone still rang now and then. Clara. Always Clara. The same number. No voicemail. She had run out of apologies before she ever learned how to give one. I let it ring. The sound didn't make me flinch anymore. It was just part of the city now. Background. Like wind against the glass. Like the scent of mint at noon. I didn't need her voice to feel like a mother. I had already given enough. And now I was learning to receive from my own silence. I baked shortbread cookies last Sunday. Same recipe. Same steps. Flour. Butter. Vanilla. The smell filled the kitchen. No one came in to say thank you. No one reached past me to grab one before they cooled. And still I smiled. Because I wanted them. Because I mattered even when no one else was watching. I placed them on a small plate next to my tea. The window was open. The city sighed in spring. Outside, a bus pulled up to the corner. People got off. Carrying groceries. Children's laughter echoed up the block. I watched. Not wistfully. Just present. Across the room the light caught on my teacup. That cup used to sit in Clara's cabinet on a shelf I wasn't allowed to touch without permission. Now it lived in a place of honor. I poured a second cup and set it across from mine. Not because I expected company, but because I was done sitting at half-filled tables. He had space now. For memory, for breath, for softness. Not everything had healed. There were nights I still woke up reaching for Paul's hand. Still mornings when I thought I heard Clara's voice young again, unbroken. But I did not chase those ghosts. I let them pass. Grief I've learned doesn't demand closure. Just a place to rest. And this apartment, this quiet corner above the city became that place. Sometimes healing is not about rebuilding bridges. It is about planting a new road where the ground is yours and no one else holds the map. The papers were all filed. The check had cleared. Diane sent a photo last night, new curtains in the front room, paint swatches laid across the table. She wrote, "I think it's still your house a little." I replied, "Not anymore. Now it's yours to love." And I meant it. Because I had already taken what I needed from that place. The knowing that I belonged even when they refused to see me. The strength to walk without a witness. The grace to start again without noise. The late sunlight touches the wood grain of the old table, and for a moment, everything feels soft again. I've learned that legacy isn't loud. Sometimes it's just a name remembered in silence, and a pie shared with grace. What quiet legacy do you hope to leave behind? We'd love to read your story in the comments below. You are not alone. Your journey matters. Subscribe to Grandma Radio, where every story is a second chance.